Okay, hello there. My name is Andrew Jordan. The voice you can hear is a sign language interpreter, so I'm working with a professionally qualified interpreter who's registered with the NRCPD. The interpreter is female, which is why I have a lady's voice today. I wanted to tell you a bit about what's been happening to me with some hospital appointments that I had here, and it actually stems back to November 2017. Late November, I started experiencing abdominal pains and I didn't know what it was, and it was so bad I could hardly move. I was in so much pain I wanted to scream. When we arrived at the hospital, here at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, at the A&E department, I went in and again, no communication, couldn't communicate with anyone, no interpreter. There was no offer of VRS instead, which is video relay service that you can use remotely. So I had no information about what medication I was being given, I wanted to communicate in pen and paper. There wasn't anything, but even so, that's very difficult for me because if you've been given very strong drugs, it's quite hard to read because it impacts on your eyesight. So I ended up staying there until the morning, and they told me I've got gallstones, problem with my gallbladder, and they said, you need to go and see your GP. Here's a letter, off you go. So I thought, oh right, okay, is that all after all that? And then the next day, I went to my local GP and I talked to them, and I was very quickly referred for a scan. And so I went through various appointments here for a scan and checks and everything. And every time I received a letter for an appointment from the hospital, there was never any information on it about the provision of an interpreter. So obviously for a deaf person, that's an extra stress. The hospital may not realise that, you know, a deaf person needs to know whether an interpreter is going to be there or not. And I would be asking, can you let me know? And nobody ever did let me know. And, you know, you never know when you come whether there is going to be an interpreter or not. So some time went by and I received a letter asking me to come here to the hospital for surgery. And I said, I'm deaf, just to let you know. But again, the letter didn't say whether there was an interpreter, so I kept ringing, you know, even before the pre-assessment, kept trying to make contact to find out. And then finally I came, and on the actual day of the operation, an interpreter was there at 7 o'clock in the morning, which I was really pleased about. Had a nice chat with her. And then she said to me, oh, you know, I'm only here for 2 hours. Booking is only 2 hours. I said, well, that can't be right because this is day surgery. I'm here for the duration. I'm here for the day because I'm having surgery. And she said, oh gosh, I didn't realise that. I'm only booked for 2 hours. So we approached a nurse and they said, oh, I don't know. So we went to reception to see whether they knew more. They didn't. Went to the senior nurse, talked to them. And they said, you know, the booking is only until, my actual surgery is at 11 o'clock. That's where I was on the waiting list. And the interpreter was going to leave at 9 o'clock. And I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be complicated. And I have been waiting nearly a year for this surgery, so you can understand I didn't want it to be put off. So I approached the senior nurse, spoke to them and said, look, you know, can I get in earlier? You know, can people come and see me more quickly before the interpreter has to go? Can we do all the conversations before then? No. Luckily, the senior nurse, she was very supportive, very positive, and she brought in the anaesthetist, and she also brought in the consultants and everybody I needed to see. So I spoke to them and we went through everything, did the consent form, all of that, but it felt very rushed. But I wouldn't want to do any of that without an interpreter. I was very aware we had a big rush on because the interpreter had to leave. So the doctor came, spoke to them, everything was agreed, sorted out early before 9:30, and they said that they would put me in first as well, which I really appreciated all that effort. But I realised that later on that the interpreter actually wasn't a fully qualified interpreter, they're a training interpreter. But I'm not critical of the interpreter at all, because I have to say, despite being a trainee, they were actually very good. They were close to qualifying, so they got quite a lot of experience. They just didn't have the qualification yet, but they were very helpful with everything that I needed to sort out before she left. and they rang language line and said, look, you know, can you find someone to please replace me for the rest of the day? And explained that that she wasn't able to extend the length of her stay because I was going to be there all day. Luckily, they did the anaesthetic before 9:30. So the interpreter went off, and then I woke up about 11 o'clock. I woke up, but I had no communication at all. And I had nurses approaching me and talking to me, and I'd have to sort of gesticulate to them, hang on, I'm deaf, and explain to me, you need to write it down with a pen and paper, please. And they would try to gesture. Luckily, I would have to say, the nurses were very nice, and I did have a good rapport with them. I found that most of the nurses were from the Philippines, and that they're very good because actually those people that are coming across here to work, there's language barriers for them too, so they're quite good at gesturing and helping with communication in a visual way. But I then went back there after I'd had the operation and no interpreter came, so I was quite concerned. I needed to talk to the doctor to know whether there had been any complications, but I wasn't able to do that. So I sent some text messages and eventually got in touch with my social worker from Inspire, which is a government-funded social work organisation. And luckily for me, they were able to drop everything and come over and see me and support me because they knew I was facing such a communication barrier. Now, I need to stress that the social worker is not a qualified interpreter. This is someone that lives in the Bexley area, and I really appreciated that they dropped everything and came and helped me. They moved me to a different room downstairs on the ground floor, and there were some nurses there. And when I arrived, we had a discussion, but there were no doctors. But they wanted to discharge me, and they didn't mention anything at that point about the anticoagulatory medication that I might need. There was no mention of that. They just said, oh, everything was fine. And so that night I left the hospital. Oh, I wanted also to say that when I first came here, when I first started experiencing the problems, I hadn't seen a consultant at all. That wasn't actually until on the day of the operation that I actually saw a consultant. So that was the first time I met them. The first day I came, they had to go off to deal with an emergency, and then I had a temporary other person who came in to speak to me. I saw them to say hello, and they passed on some notes, but the consultant wasn't available. So I just saw things like the senior nurse, people like senior nurses, etc. And that had been my experience all the way through, up until the surgery on the day when I actually did see the consultant for the first time. So that was quite a concern for me as well. But I'd like to just talk now about the things that were really positive about the experience. I would like to say how fantastic the nurses were, particularly the Filipino nurses that cared for me, what a good effort they made to adjust their communication so that I could communicate with them. The ambulatory care unit, the receptionist there was also lovely, fantastic rapport with her, very smiley, nice, helpful lady. And when I came in for my last appointment with the ambulatory care unit, the senior nurse there as well approached me and took me in and did my blood pressure and things like that. And she was lovely, wrote everything down, got everything prepared, got everything written, and that was great. So that was part of my first complaint. But those were some of the positive things that happened. So, there was some examples of good communication with staff. The doctor also at the ACU, fantastic, wrote everything down, had a great conversation with him, good rapport. So, those were some of the people that made things better for me. After the operation, I developed a cramp in one of my legs, and it over a period of time got much, much worse, and I thought, this can't be right. The next day, the doctor texted me and said, you need to come and see me, this is urgent. You need to go and come to the GP surgery now. So I went to the GPs. I said, come on, what's the fuss? What's going on? You have a DVT in your leg. which means that I will contact the ACU at the hospital and let them know that you're going to be coming in urgently, and I will explain as well that you need an interpreter. The doctor wrote actually on my results that I'm a deaf person and that I would need an interpreter. So he said, I will do that for you, so you've got that to take with you. So when I came to ACU, there was no interpreter here, but I realised because it was short notice we were going to have to do it with pen and paper. But quite often people have video phones that you can use in an emergency, but there is no service like that here, unfortunately. Right, so there's no system in place to actually let you know when it's your turn to see the doctor. So I introduced myself and let them know that I was there, and I was sitting there for a very long time waiting for someone to come and see me, and I was in quite a lot of pain in my leg. Okay, so I was approached by an HCA and they started talking to me, and I said, look, I'm deaf, and they carried on talking, and I tried to lip read them, but I have to say I can just about lip read my name because that's something, you know, you get used to from growing up. So I was able to establish it was me she was looking for. She took me off to another room, and I'm quite used to coming to hospitals, kind of know what goes on. I'm used to being weighed, measured, blood pressure checks, that sort of thing. I'm very used to it. But the whole time, the HCA kept talking to me, and I kept saying, can you write it down? And they kept dismissing me and saying, no, you don't need to. So I went with the flow. You know, I kind of know the process. I had a blood test. I thought, oh, okay, we're in a blood test, right? And then it seemed like the HCA was kind of controlling everything. And I had asked several times, could they write down what they were saying? And they refused to. And I tried to make it clear, I cannot lip read them. And they expected me to. In fact, for most deaf people, lip reading isn't possible. One sentence, in a sentence I may get 30% of that. And if I've got no context, I haven't got a hope in hell of getting it. So they asked me if I could sit down on a chair, and they were doing something I hadn't seen before. I didn't know what it was. And the HCA was sitting opposite me with a machine. And I thought, I don't even know what that is. What am I supposed to do? I said, can you just write down, can you tell me what it is that you're doing? And she said, no, just don't worry about it, stay there. And I just sort of thought, for me, that's really demoralising to be dismissed in that way. I thought, well, I don't even know what you're doing to me. You've done blood tests, you've done my blood pressure, you've done all this other stuff, now you're doing something, I don't even know what you're doing. So I had to say, could you please write it down? She said, no, it's fine, don't worry. And I started to get a bit cross at this point because I was being denied access to communication. And I was in a lot of pain with my leg with the DVT, and I knew that was very high risk. I knew that blood clots are quite a serious thing, and it was important that it was resolved. So rather than me absolutely losing it and storming off, I thought, right, I choose to stay, even though this isn't going very well. I didn't want to lose my self-esteem and stuff, but I thought, well, I need to put up with this. So she then said, right, follow me. And well, basically she gestured to me to follow her. And I followed her, and then she stopped and had a conversation with someone, and they asked me, lucky that I could just about pick this up from lip reading. They'd said to me, are you lip reading? And I said, well, I can only a little bit, but not really. I could tell that what they were saying was that they seemed to think that I could lip read, and I tried to make it clear that I'd been trying to ask for everything to be written down. And in the end, the other person that the HCA was talking to wrote a note on my file and handed it over, and then said goodbye, and off they went and just left me on my own. And I was sitting there. There were other people lying in beds near me who were having blood transfusions at the time. And I sat there and I wondered where I was, really. I thought, okay, this is a bit odd. Oh yeah, I'd had no explanations, didn't really know what was going on, what was going to happen next. And I thought, this is weird because I've been left in this area where people were having blood transfusions. And I thought, I don't understand, this doesn't compute at all. I'm really confused. So I saw a male nurse who was coming towards me, and he was checking other people there. So I thought, well, I'm going to ask him. So I gestured to him, look, I'm deaf. Have you got pen and paper? And he went, oh, yeah. So he got pen and paper. And I wrote down, why am I here? What's going on? Nobody had explained anything to me. And he asked me my name. He said, I'll find out more. Went away, came back and explained. He said, oh, you're just waiting to see the consultant now. That's why you're sitting here. I said, oh, thank you. And I was there for about 10 minutes. And so I was really grateful. I was pleased to know why I was sitting there finally. But I hadn't been given any information previously from the nurse that had been treating me. I felt like I'd been treated like a dog. It was like, right, go and sit. And it was really like, in the back of my mind, I thought, I've got to stay here because sorting out this DVT is important. When the doctor came along, I was shocked because he was ready to write down stuff with me, and he got my notes and everything. And I realised that whoever that person was the nurse had met in the corridor had passed that information on. They'd taken over and made sure that the next part of it was going to be okay. So talking to that doctor, I got the information I needed, the explanations, we went through everything step by step. That's when they scanned my leg. And then they waited for my bloods to come back, looked at that and told me everything. So finally I'd got the full picture and I could understand. But prior to that, I'd been completely in the dark, wondering what was going on. I was sitting there thinking, am I going to lose my leg? I'd had nobody to sort of comfort me and tell me what was going on. I'd finally got the full picture. I was getting the medication. Finally, I could understand what was going on with my health. And after the scan, and I had the results, went back to see the doctor again and explained everything clearly and wrote it all out. And I really appreciated that. The way that they made the effort to adapt how they communicated with me. And it was a real shame that the HCA had such a different approach and different attitude towards me. I've never been treated as badly as that in a hospital before. I felt that this wasn't right. I felt that I'd had this imposed on me. I felt that I had been treated really disrespectfully. I know that hospitals are quite complicated. You have lots of staff, and I know you say that you do diversity and equality training, and you do it once a year. That's a bit of a concern, and it's probably one morning, isn't it, a year? But equality and diversity covers a real range of stuff. You could be talking about race, disability, religion. It covers a real plethora of different areas. So one morning, that's a lot to get in. And talking about disability, is there enough time to really, within that training, explain how to be accessible? Deafness itself is a really separate kind of issue, because as a disability, it's not about the physical aspects that most people experience. It's about a lack of access to language, communication and information. And it's only about clear information, basically. So that's what I need you to look at. That's what could be improved. The frontline staff, I'm well aware that they are dealing with deaf people, different people with different types of disability, people with different languages. So the frontline staff have got an awful lot of adapting to do to manage with them. But sometimes they're not aware of interpreters, how to book interpreters, where to get them, or whether there's even a VRS service that could be used, if there's a tablet somewhere, where that actually lives in the hospital. So much more focus needs to be put on that area, particularly for deaf patients. In the letter it mentions the booking team. If you have a doctor's appointment, and then there's me, and then there's the booking team, and then the booking team go out to language line. That's a whole load of people involved in that transaction, but who actually makes the decision as to how long an appointment lasts? So it seems for me that there's no clear procedure in place to actually identify how long an interpreter would be needed. So I felt 2 hours, I had a whole host of stuff to be dealt with that day. 2 hours was not long enough. Plus I was having surgery. I was there for the full day. 2 hours, a 2-hour provision, when I'm going to be on the hospital premises for the whole day. They thought they were going to do my surgery at about 11 o'clock. And then, so I had, from the time the interpreter left until I woke up, there's a few hours with no interpreter. I woke up, they're gone. So I realised that I wasn't then able to communicate with anyone. It's impossible for me to talk to staff, to communicate with them if there's no interpreter there. So whoever does the bookings, they need to be much more aware of how long the appointment actually is, so that Language Line are aware when they're being asked to provide the interpreter. But really, it's a clinician's thing. They run the clinics. They know how long people are likely to be waiting, how long a wait list is for surgery, how long a consultation takes, whether you're going to have blood tests first, all of that sort of thing. That's going to add to the length of duration that you're there. You're going to have medication or treatment. As a professional organisation, they should have actually challenged the booking team when they said 2 hours for day surgery. They should have realised that that wasn't realistic. But Language Line were also a little naughty too, in that they didn't provide a registered sign language interpreter. A qualified interpreter can translate a consent form because they're trained and qualified and registered to do that. But a training interpreter, for example, if something went wrong, if something happened to me, that training interpreter who's interpreted the consent form, there could be an issue with that further down the line. So I'm really surprised that Language Line didn't seem to be aware that an RSLI was the most appropriate person to be there on the day. My first language is sign language. So what I would really like to see is that the hospital are better prepared so that they do have something like a VRS service, 24-hour interpreting service available. So there is at least that first point of contact, which means that you would have better communication from the get-go when you're asking questions. Do you have any allergies, anything like that? What's your history, your family history? How has this happened to you? Those kind of immediate questions that the medics are going to want to ask. That can be done through video relay, which allows the doctors then to immediately start thinking about what they can do next. Lots of deaf people actually can't read English. They rely on sign language, so they can read to a degree, but you'll find that lots of deaf people are very limited in how much they understand from written English. And also when you're in pain, you have to bear in mind, trying to read is really hard. You're so distracted by the pain. But now what I'm finding is I get a letter and I'm having to, I'm a deaf person trying to make phone calls, and people don't seem to be aware that I'm deaf. And they say, yeah, it's booked, it's booked. And I sit and wait. And I think, well, do I have an interpreter? Am I forced to ring again to try and find out? And then I turn up at the appointment and discover actually there isn't an interpreter. And that's really frustrating. It's really important that people know how to recognise who is a qualified interpreter and who is a training interpreter. So registered interpreters are required to bring their ID card with them. Without that, the deaf community are advised not to use the interpreters and to send them away. So a qualified interpreter, someone who's a fully registered interpreter, has a yellow ID card, and that means they can work in the legal domain, so they can do things like consent forms. Training interpreters, they can do consultations with doctors, they can do medical appointments, they can do blood tests, those kinds of things. They have a purple ID card, but they're very different to an RSLI.